The town of Red Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing stayed secret for long. The dusty main street stretched between rows of wooden buildings, general stores, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and a saloon that seemed louder than the rest of the town combined. Horses stood tied to rails, their tails flicking lazily in the warm wind, while townspeople moved slowly through their daily routines. But what Red Creek was truly known for wasn't its buildings or its quiet streets. It was known for its whispers. In a town like this, people watched everything, and they talked about everything even more. Clara Whitmore had grown up in Red Creek, and once upon a time, people had spoken kindly about her. She was the daughter of Thomas Whitmore, a hard-working man who had spent his life farming the small piece of land just outside town. Her father had always been respected, and because of that, Clara had been treated warmly by most of the townsfolk. But things change quickly when the person who protected you is no longer there. 6 months earlier, Clara's father had passed away after a long illness. The loss had left her with a small house, a few belongings, and more worries than she knew how to handle. At first, some neighbors offered sympathy, but sympathy faded quickly in Red Creek. Soon the whispers started. Some people said she wouldn't last long living alone. Others claimed her father had left debts behind. Clara knew most of it wasn't true, but once rumors began spreading, stopping them felt impossible. Still, Clara refused to let bitterness change who she was. Her father had raised her to believe that kindness mattered, even when life was unfair. And she held tightly to that belief. 5 days earlier, Clara had been riding home from the market just before sunset. The sky was glowing orange above the rolling hills, and the quiet forest road was nearly empty. She had a small sack of supplies tied to her saddle, and her mind was busy thinking about repairs the house needed before winter arrived. That was when she noticed something strange ahead. A horse stood near the edge of the trees, wandering slowly without a rider. Clara slowed her own horse, frowning. A horse without its rider often meant trouble. Sometimes travelers fell, other times it meant something worse. She guided her horse closer and looked around carefully. Then she saw him. A man lay on the ground near a fallen log, half hidden by tall grass. His coat was torn, and there was blood on his forehead. One arm rested awkwardly beneath him as if he had collapsed suddenly. Clara's heart jumped. She quickly climbed down from her saddle and rushed over. "Sir," she called gently, kneeling beside him. "Can you hear me?" The man didn't move. For a moment she hesitated. In the old Western territories, helping strangers could be dangerous. Outlaws sometimes passed through the forests, and injured men weren't always innocent men. But leaving someone to die wasn't something Clara could do. She carefully turned him onto his back and wiped the blood away with a cloth from her bag. The wound on his head looked painful but not deadly. His breathing was slow but steady. Clara tore a long strip from her scarf and wrapped it tightly around his head to stop the bleeding. Then she dragged him slowly into the shade beneath a tree so the evening sun wouldn't burn his face. It took nearly an hour before the man finally stirred. His eyes opened slowly, dark and confused. "Where am I?" he whispered. "You're safe," Clara said softly. "You were lying in the woods. I found you." He blinked several times as if trying to understand what had happened. "You helped me?" he asked weakly. Clara nodded. "You were hurt. I cleaned the wound and waited for you to wake up." The man studied her face for a long moment. Something about his expression carried both surprise and gratitude. "You didn't know who I was," he said quietly. "And you still stopped." Clara shrugged slightly. "My father used to say that doing the right thing shouldn't depend on knowing someone." The man let out a faint breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Your father sounds like a wise man." Clara smiled sadly. He was. After resting for a while, the stranger slowly sat up. He looked a little dizzy but strong enough to stand. Clara helped him walk to his horse and handed him her water flask. "Drink," she said. He took a few careful sips before returning it. "Thank you," he said sincerely. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet forest around them rustled gently in the evening breeze. Finally the man asked, "What's your name?" "Clara." He nodded thoughtfully. "My name is Daniel Hayes." The name meant nothing to Clara, but she nodded politely anyway. Daniel looked at her with a serious expression. "I won't forget what you did today." Clara waved her hand dismissively, slightly embarrassed. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Just ride somewhere safe and get that wound checked again." Daniel climbed into the saddle slowly. Before leaving, he looked down at her one more time. "Kindness like yours is rare," he said. Then he turned his horse and rode down the forest trail until he disappeared between the trees. Clara watched him go for a moment before climbing back onto her own horse. She believed that was the end of the story. But life in Red Creek had already begun moving in a direction she didn't expect. Because back in town, a man named Mr. Bradley had already started telling people something dangerous, that Clara Whitmore owed him money. And in a place where rumors spread faster than truth, the stage was already set for something that would soon humiliate her in front of the entire town. What Clara didn't know yet was that the stranger whose life she had saved would return sooner than anyone imagined. And when he did, Red Creek would witness a moment no one would ever forget. The morning sun rose slowly over the quiet town of Red Creek, casting long golden rays across the dusty streets. Most mornings in town were peaceful, with shopkeepers opening their doors, horses stamping lazily in front of wooden posts, and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the small bakery near the corner. But on this particular morning, something felt different. A small crowd had already gathered near the edge of the street, whispering among themselves while watching a troubling scene unfold. Clara Whitmore stood in front of her small wooden house, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. The house wasn't large or fancy, but it had been her father's home for many years. Every plank of wood, every creaking step on the porch, carried memories of the life she had shared with him. Since his passing, it had become the only place where she still felt close to him. But now that home was being taken from her, two men hired by Mr. Bradley were tying ropes around the porch posts and removing items from inside the house. They worked without emotion, as if this were just another ordinary task. Mr. Bradley himself stood a few steps away, adjusting his vest while watching everything with a smug expression. He held a folded piece of paper in his hand, the same paper he had used the day before to accuse Clara of owing him money. Townspeople stood nearby, watching quietly. Some leaned against fences, others stood in small groups whispering to one another. Clara could feel their eyes on her, and the humiliation burned in her chest. It wasn't just that she was losing her home, it was that the entire town seemed willing to watch it happen. Bradley cleared his throat, loudly, making sure everyone could hear him. "Well, Miss Whitmore," he said with a mocking smile, "I'll give you one last opportunity. $30. If you can pay it now, I'll call this whole thing off." Clara looked at him with steady eyes despite the anger inside her. "You know that debt isn't real," she said firmly. Bradley shrugged. "Then you should have proof." Those words felt like a knife twisting deeper. Clara's father had indeed paid his debts before he died. She had seen the receipt with her own eyes. But after his death, the paper had disappeared. She had searched every drawer, every box, every corner of the house, but it was gone. Bradley knew that, and he was using it against her. The crowd murmured quietly as the men continued pulling furniture through the door. Her father's old chair, a small wooden table, and a box of tools he had once used every day. Clara's heart ached as she watched. "Start clearing the rest," Bradley ordered the men. One of them pushed the door wide open and stepped inside again. At that moment, a faint sound echoed down the road. Hoofbeats. At first, no one paid attention. Riders passed through Red Creek all the time. But the sound grew louder. Closer. Faster. Soon the galloping horse appeared at the end of the street, kicking up a cloud of dust behind it. The rider slowed as he approached the crowd, then pulled sharply on the reins, bringing the horse to a stop in the center of the road. The sudden arrival made several people turn their heads. The rider swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion. Clara looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. It was Daniel. The stranger she had helped in the forest 5 days earlier now stood there, strong and steady, his dark coat brushing against the side of his horse as he stepped forward. His eyes moved slowly across the scene. He saw the crowd first. Then the men removing furniture. Then Mr. Bradley holding the paper. Finally, his gaze landed on Clara. Her dress was dusty, her face pale, and the quiet strength she tried to maintain could not completely hide the humiliation she was enduring. Daniel's expression hardened. He walked forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. "What's going on here?" he asked calmly. Bradley turned toward him with irritation. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," he said sharply. "This woman owes me money and refuses to pay." Daniel glanced briefly at Clara. She shook her head slightly. "It's not true," she said quietly. Bradley scoffed. "Of course she'd say that." Daniel stepped closer. "How much does she supposedly owe you?" $30, Bradley replied confidently. Without hesitation, Daniel reached inside his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. The sound of coins clinking together echoed faintly as he opened it. He dropped the pouch into Bradley's hand. "There," Daniel said calmly. $30. The crowd murmured in surprise. Bradley looked down at the coins, clearly pleased. "Well," he said quickly, "that settles the matter." But Daniel didn't move. Instead, he extended his hand. "Now show me the paper." Bradley frowned. "Why would you want to see it?" "Because," Daniel replied evenly, "I'd like to know exactly what I just paid for." Bradley hesitated but finally handed the paper over. Daniel unfolded it slowly and studied the signature at the bottom. His eyes moved carefully across the page for a few seconds. Then he looked up again. "This signature isn't real." The crowd immediately began whispering louder. Bradley's face flushed red. "And how would you know that?" he snapped. Daniel calmly reached into his coat again and pulled out another folded document. "Because this," he said, holding it up, "is the real receipt." Clara gasped softly. Bradley's confident expression disappeared. Instantly, Daniel continued speaking so the entire crowd could hear. "I stopped at the bank in the next town yesterday," he explained. The banker remembered Clara's father clearly. He confirmed the debt had already been paid months ago. People in the crowd began exchanging shocked looks. Daniel held both papers side by side. "One of these is real," he said coldly. "And one of them is a forgery." At that moment, the town sheriff stepped forward. He took both papers and examined them carefully. After a long moment, he looked directly at Bradley. "You're coming with me." The crowd gasped as the sheriff grabbed Bradley by the arm. "You can't be serious," Bradley shouted, struggling. "Forgery and fraud are serious enough," the sheriff replied firmly as he began leading him away. The same man who had humiliated Clara in front of the entire town was now being dragged away while people stared in stunned silence. Daniel turned back toward Clara. For a moment neither of them spoke. The furniture removal had stopped. The men stood awkwardly, unsure what to do next. Clara finally looked at Daniel, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Why did you come back?" Daniel gave a small smile. "You saved my life," he said simply. "I figured the least I could do was return the favor." Clara looked around at the crowd that had watched her humiliation only moments earlier. Then she looked back at the man who had ridden into town just in time to change everything. And for the first time in many months, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope.